Teresa Crew. Teresa is a senior lecturer in social policy at Bangor University. She's not your typical academic, but she has just finished writing her book on working class academics, written because she wants her students to know that not every academic is posh. Teresa sent me her video to share with you all, but I just want to see if Teresa's got anything that she'd like to say before I press play.
I think the only thing is trying to fit everything in 15 minutes, so if anyone has any questions, please feel free. Hi, my name's Teresa Crew, and I'm really proud to be part of this conference, mainly because not enough people speak about class because, well, as we're told, we're all middle class these days. So it's been fantastic listening to a lot of the presentations, and I'd like to continue on in that vein to talk about social class. So this, my presentation is based on a research project that I did that talks about working class academic capital. So if it's not immediately apparent, I am a working class academic, and that was really brought home to me when I've talked to students, because they would often say things like this. They would talk about, you know, that I was normal or approachable. And at first I thought that these comments were situated in gender. I thought they were related to me being female, but the more and more I thought about it, and when I spoke to some other academic colleagues, namely male working class colleagues, I realised it's much more than that. It wasn't just about the fact that I was female. A lot of it was based on that I still live in the same housing estate. I talk in very, very similar ways to many of my students. They just felt comfortable with me. And I think it's because I often remind them of the background, where they come from, where they live. So I decided to do this research project where I interviewed, I've put here is 87 self-defined working class academics. We won't get into the issue about, you know, how do you define somebody who's working class academic. I can discuss that in Q&A if you'd like. But I interviewed 87 people. It's actually over 87 people, but that's what I've recorded for now. Recruited people via Twitter, academic conferences. I should note that when I say academic conferences, I actually mean more social science type conferences. So obviously this means that my my sample of these 87 academics tend to be, it's about 2/3 are from the arts and humanities, 1/3 from STEM subjects. Also, Twitter was very, very good to actually recruit people, by the way. I've also utilised these different theories as well by Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about at times the capital that working class people lack in middle class spaces. Yosso Torreyoso, who first used her theories to look at BME groups and the capital that they have, I utilised her theory to talk about, well, no, actually, working class people do have a huge amount of capital in middle class spaces. And then Crenshaw as well, I utilised her to talk about intersectionality, because, you know, there are different intersections of a working class personality. So one of the areas that I looked at was, what are the positive aspects of being a working class academic? And, you know, there is, in the book that I'm writing, unfortunately, there is at least 2 chapters that talk about the negative aspects. But for this presentation, I thought I'd focus on what are the positive aspects. So most people I spoke to, just going back to that picture a moment ago, talked about student support over and over again. I think it might have been at least 3/4, possibly about 80% of my respondents talked about the student support that they provided. And this quotation here by one of my respondents explains why we are so talented, so good at providing student support. One of the reasons being is that, you know, often we are used to, we understand the sacrifices that our students have had to make, our working class students, students from difficult backgrounds have had to make to actually enter university. You know, for instance, they may have caring responsibilities, little, you know, money, little economic capital, and also, you know, talking about a life that doesn't kind of gel with the university experience. And I'm sure you know that the way that the university experience is talked about today, it's really focused around the middle class student who can move away from home, the first time away from home, that sort of thing. So in terms of student support, one way that working class academics supported students was actually helping them into higher education. And these are just two methods that were used. So just by the pure fact of being a working class academic can actually make you a role model. So for instance, Jane, a researcher in biological sciences, talked about just by having somebody from her background would have encouraged her to actually consider a career in the sciences. And a lot of my respondents talked about how they would, visit underperforming schools. They would actually make sure that they were there at open days to make sure that they represented, not just students, the typical students that we saw, but the working class students, the students that are from similar backgrounds. Also, my respondents talked about, so for instance, Lynn here mentioned that she ran a monthly drop-in session at a local community centre, and this would talk about, she would help students choose courses, she would just talk about what it's like to be in university in general, help them write personal statements as well. All these sorts of hidden knowledge that you don't have if you don't have a family background who's actually familiar with university. So that was another way that, as I say, many respondents talked about supporting students. They also talked about how they supported students through higher education. So the two key methods, again, role models was important. But in this way, what my respondents would do is they did not just see themselves as role models, that they would bring role models back in from the community into university. So for instance, they would ensure that their speakers were diverse, not just to have the usual, success stories. They would make sure that their speakers were diverse. And also make sure that their reading lists were diverse, would have, more, not just the typical person on the reading list, but to ensure that we saw and heard from working class writers. That was so important to my respondents. Another thing is my respondents talked about making sure that they were as welcoming as possible to those students who might not traditionally fit in. And this is where a working class academic can really come into their own. Just by being there as perhaps that role model, you can make other students feel that they deserved and should be there as well. And I have many quotations that talk about that. This one in particular, Eileen, talked about how once a term, she meets up with students and doesn't just chat about academic work, but also talks about other different areas of interest. And one of the things that I noticed was my respondents would often use much more personal approaches with students. And these students would really appreciate this, that the lecturer would talk to them on a much more personal level, much more down-to-earth level. And that's what particularly helped in terms of, developing, support for students in that way. That's why they were so good at student support. Another issue that I found when I analysed the data was it wasn't just about student support as in, being there if the student needs to talk to somebody, being a representative. It was also about their teaching approach. So when I first started looking at the findings, I would notice things here and there. And as the analysis went on and as the interviews went on, I started picking up what I term as a working class academic pedagogy. And I still struggle to say that word now. So it's a teaching approach. This is how I've defined it. It's a teaching approach that has social justice at its heart, which I'll discuss as we go on. It's also, it comes from a student's, a strength-based perspective. So seeing your students as actually bringing something to academia. They're not there just to be empty vessels to, bank information in, which is what Freire would say. And also it encouraged students to see themselves as co-creators of knowledge. And my academics would talk about how they would also embrace shared experiences, which I'll explain a little bit. So in terms of embracing shared experiences, there's two examples here from my respondents. So Jamie, a lecturer in history, and Theo, a politics research fellow, talked about how they utilised their own experiences. So Jamie as having family members who were involved in the Battle of Orgreave, and then Theo, a politics research fellow who actually had family members on the Empire Windrush. They utilised both of these experiences in their teaching. But it wasn't just about these respondents using their own lived experience. Many of the students also were had actually had family members involved in the Battle of Orgreave. They also had family members actually who were on Empire Windrush. So this is a nice way of actually teaching about different issues, historical facts, by actually utilising not just the lecturer's experience but a shared experience, and students really did appreciate that. And one of the reasons why they did, this is a comment that I got, is that the respondent talked about how old style, so the typical academic from like an elite background, they felt made theory sound dry. So they gave the example, this respondent does, of, for instance, talking about poverty. And if you're going to talk about poverty and not sound angered or frustrated or upset, that is off-putting for students, because our students actually think that lecturers are there to be good people standing up for individuals. And often the students would talk to this respondent about how lecturers just don't sound like that. They sound too removed from it. And what was so good, I kept on hearing over and over about working class academics, is they do sound angry and pissed off about some of the, the inequalities that there are in society. So that was one of the issues. Then also they engaged with students from a strengths perspective. So what I mean by this, now Zippin talks about dark or hidden funds. It's supposed to say funds of knowledge, my apologies. But this idea of students having funds of knowledge, it's not just about, the happy funds of knowledge, but it's also these dark or hidden funds of knowledge. So experience of domestic violence, mental illness, drug addiction. Of course, this is not, these dark funds of knowledge are not something that only working class academics or working class students would have. But what I found is the working class academics, again, we're talking about 3/4 of my respondents, would mention using, utilising the strengths of students in their teaching. So, for instance, Lucy talked about how she said her students had produced some wonderful piece of writing that touched upon the personal experience of poverty and mental health. So rather than just teach about mental health, the issue was that she actually talked about mental health in relation to poverty and also related it to her own circumstances, and students felt comfortable enough to do that themselves. So again, I mentioned right at the start about students being co-creators of knowledge. And Unity here, I really liked the quote that Unity had. She said, "We know our subject areas, but co-creating with students shows respect for their knowledge." And that is something that university as a whole hasn't always had, respect for the knowledge of working class students. If you think about the literature, and if you read any of the literature on working class students, you will hear over and over about their lack of study skills, basically their lack thereof. And what was so, it was so heartening to see that the academics I spoke to really did respect the skills that and the knowledge that their own students had. So respondents talked about having students involved in course redesign, choosing between different assessment methods. The students weren't just passengers on their degree, they were involved in their degree throughout. And I really did find it really heartening, because this wasn't just 1 or 2 respondents who talked this way. This was at least 3/4 of my respondents who talked about seeing students as being co-creators of knowledge. So in terms of, as well, embedding social justice was all the way through, and examples of that. So the idea was that they wanted the courses to be representative of, not just national working class people, but local working class people. And the way that they did that was just including in their assessments as the opportunity to raise money for organisations, social media campaigns actually being an assessment, and also connecting their assignments with the aim of social change. So it wasn't just talking about social change and describing what that was, but my students actually were the social change. And this was, so the students were the social change by virtue of the respondents that I spoke to. This was really heartening to see working class knowledge being used to actually, working class students and working class academics working together to push knowledge, not just from the dry halls of academia, but actually to make an impact in society. So I'm going to end this presentation with just to say, how can we move forward? Well, I have a couple of suggestions. Firstly, it's pretty obvious we need to recognise class inequalities. I could produce a much longer presentation talking about the class inequalities that I found amongst the people that I spoke to for this research study. We have to recognise them. Also, we've got to challenge stereotypes. So again, this idea that when we see somebody who is a working class person working in academia, some people would suggest that I'm not a working class person due to my job. But it's these lazy stereotypes that mean because I've now got some form of a traditional education that I've moved out of the working classes. Well, that isn't true. And I won't have anybody impose on me what my identity is. Also, we've got to show solidarity to people, not just for working class people, but others on the margins of academia. We know how few and far between there are lecturers from, with disabilities, lecturers, we only need to look at statistics of black female professors to see, they are woefully underrepresented. So we should be there to support them as well. Reach out to people like yourself, which is why I wanted to do this research study. But also, finally, just to end, remember that you bring your own capital into higher education. The things that you actually bring into academia, for me, beat somebody from a traditional academic background, hands down. If you're a student that I'm speaking to, you bring your own funds of knowledge. So please, I would suggest, don't forget the knowledge that you bring into academia. You're not there just to be spoken at. You can also contribute. Okay.
Thank you so much, Teresa.